I'm Kristen Seefeld, and the topic that we're going to talk about today is poverty, income inequality, and social policy. So poverty is not a straightforward concept, even though it's a term that gets used quite a bit. It can take on different meanings depending on time and place and context. So, for example, in Western industrialized democracies, there might be a very different idea about what it means for someone to be poor in those countries compared to people who live in a less economically developed country in Central America, for example. Also, poverty is understood differently at different points in history. So poverty was thought of differently in an era where most North Americans lived in very rural areas without electricity and indoor plumbing, so say in the early 1800s, compared to the current time period when those standards of living are really taken for granted by many. So in this segment, we'll go over some of the conceptual definitions of poverty, how it gets measured with a particular focus on poverty measurement in the U.S. We'll discuss some shortcomings of that measure, and then we'll turn to a different but related concept, and that's of income inequality. I'll conclude with a brief discussion of some of the policy tools used to combat poverty and some of the debates surrounding those policies in the United States. So conceptually, we can think of poverty in a number of different ways. Most frequently, poverty is discussed in relationship to some very low form of income. In large part, this is because income can be somewhat easy to measure, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. So definitions of poverty based on income are very commonly used. That's because low income can mean that individuals and households face difficulty meeting their basic needs. For example, you might not have enough money to buy food, you might not have enough money to pay for housing. In the literature, being unable to meet a basic need is often called an experience of material hardship. And poverty and material hardship sometimes go hand in hand, but not necessarily. More recently, scholars, policymakers, and advocates have been defining poverty in a more multidimensional way. So that is, they're arguing that not only should we think about poverty as being about very low income or being unable to make basic needs, but we also need to think about poverty in terms of the way that it can keep people marginalized and exclude them from full participation in society. For example, you might think about being poor as meaning that you end up living in a segregated environment and you have access to schools that aren't as good. So the constructs such as these are often referred to as social exclusion. It can be a dimension of poverty, but again, more often income is the measure that we're using. So let's talk a little bit more about the measurement of poverty using income. So there's two broad ways to think about poverty as it relates to income. One is defining poverty relative to a certain threshold or a cutoff. For example, saying that everyone who has an income below some certain dollar amount, and that dollar amount is usually something people consider to be meaningful, those folks are poor. This is an absolute measure. The second way of setting a threshold is to set it to be relative to the income of the rest of the country or an area that you think is important to consider. So both the World Bank and the U.S. Census Bureau use absolute measures of poverty. Currently, the World Bank says that anyone that is living on income that is less than $1.90 per person per day is considered poor. And the U.S. Census Bureau, which measures poverty in the United States, says that anyone who lives in a family of 2 adults and 2 children in 2017 would be considered poor if their annual income was less than $24,858, so a very specific number. So anyone whose income was at or above that number would not be considered poor. Families of that size and that composition who had income below that number would be poor. So let's consider the U.S. measure a little bit more closely. Where did that number of a little over $24,000 come from? So in the early 1960s, an economist named Molly Orshansky was tasked with coming up with a way to measure poverty. What she had available to her at that time was a fairly limited amount of data. She ended up coming up with a measure that took as an assumption that food consists of 1/3 of families' budgets. And in the early 1960s, that was a perfectly valid assumption to make. She then looked at what it would cost to eat a low-cost, what was called a thrifty diet. Those numbers varied a bit by family size. They varied by whether or not there were children in the household. She figured out what that number was, multiplied it by 3, and then there was our poverty threshold. She then looked at all the income that families had coming into their house, and the U.S. poverty measure considers income to be all before tax, cash-based income, that's earned or otherwise collected by members of the households. That income is tallied up and then compared to what the poverty threshold is for a family of that size. And again, a family that has 2 individuals living in it has a different poverty threshold than a family that has 3 individuals living into it. A household that has 2 adults and 1 child has a different poverty threshold than a family that has 1 adult and 2 children. Each year, those thresholds get adjusted for increases in cost of living, but other than that, there's no other adjustments made. So there's a lot of criticisms of this measure. I'll name a few. You can probably think of some others as well. So the first one is that with one very significant exception, the poverty threshold does not vary at all by geography. So a family that lives in New York City that has a very high cost of living faces the same poverty threshold as a family that might live in a very rural area where costs of living are a lot lower. The only exceptions to this are the states of Alaska and Hawaii, which have much higher poverty thresholds, and that is because those are states where most food has to be imported, and because this is a food-based measure, the original construction of the poverty line took that into account. The second criticism that I'll note is that the current measure of poverty doesn't reflect changes over time in the composition of households' budgets. So recall that the current measure assumes that families spend 1/3 of their income on food. Again, that was true in the 1960s. That's no longer the case now. Currently, families spend a lot more of their budgets on housing costs, and the measure of poverty that we use today does not take that into account. Others note that the way we measure income might not be capturing all of the resources that are available to families. So benefits that come in the form of cash are counted, but if someone is receiving a public benefit that has a cash value, like a housing assistance voucher, that in-kind income is not counted. Others believe that families, when they talk to researchers from the Census Bureau, underestimate the amount of money that they have, leading some critics to argue that we have an overestimate of the number of families in poverty as well. You can visit the Census Bureau's website to learn more about the various measures. It's also important to note that the Census Bureau has tried to take some of these criticisms into account, and they have constructed what they call a supplemental measure of poverty that tries to have some geographic variation so that urban areas have a higher threshold than rural areas, that take into account the changes in families' budget compositions. So if you visit their website, you can look and see how does the official measure, as it's called, compare to the supplemental measure, and do things really changed a lot for different types of families. A relative measure of poverty is a little bit less straightforward to talk about, so let's walk through it a little slowly using a hypothetical example. So what's shown here on this graph is a hypothetical country's income distribution. So let's say in this country, households have income ranging all the way from nothing, zero, up to $100. And this is shown on the x-axis, or the horizontal line of this graph. For the sake of illustration, let's assume that what we're going to do is line up all of the households in this country by their income, from the smallest to the largest. So starting with the household that has zero, all the way up to the household that has $100. If we did that in this hypothetical example, let's say that we find that the middle household has an income of $50. So because this is the middle household, this is the median income for this hypothetical country. The income distribution also shows us that very few people, represented by the y-axis or the vertical line on this graph, have zero income, and very few people actually have $100 of income. So the shape of the distribution shows us that indeed most people have incomes around the median. This isn't necessarily important for thinking about a relative measure of poverty, but keep this in mind when we talk about income inequality in a moment. So in countries that use a relative measure of poverty, what they then typically do is look at the median income of their country and then set a poverty threshold at some percentage of median income. So, for example, some countries say that incomes that are 33% of the median, that is the poverty threshold. So to get back to our hypothetical example, in this country where $50 is the median income, if we took 33% of that $50, we would get $16.50. So using this metric, all people who have income below $16.50, if you look at the graph, sort of the area that's shaded with red bars, those folks are considered poor. So far, the relative measure doesn't appear all that different from the absolute measure, right? Both are setting a level of income and saying people who have income above this measure are not poor, people who have income below it are poor, except that the relative measure does bear some relationship to the median income of the country. However, a relative measure can account for changes in standards of living in a way that an absolute measure can't. So let's say that the following year, everybody in the country has more money. If we look at the graph, what we see is that the income distribution shifts to the right. So remember before, in the previous year, incomes ranged from $0 to $100. In this new year, incomes range from about $15 up to $150. So in this example, instead of a median income of $50, the median income would be $65. If we just used an absolute measure, if we had decided to say poverty is anyone with income below $16.50, it would look like in this new era where people are better off, that almost nobody is poor. You'd have to look at that dashed line that's going over to the y-axis, and it looks like we've reduced poverty, which, that's a good thing. But if we recalculate 33% of the new median income, so 33% of the $65, we get a higher threshold, $21.45. And so by saying the poverty threshold is always 33% of median income, we reset what the threshold is, and indeed more people look like they are poor, the solid blue line, compared to the dashed line below. So sort of the important takeaway point is that the relative measure assumes that in a given country or given area, some set of people will always be worse off economically compared to others, even if overall their country's economic condition is improving. So in some ways, it has within it that notion of social exclusion, perhaps, that there's a set of folks that are always kind of lagging behind economically compared to where everyone else in the country is. An absolute measure of poverty doesn't have this assumption embedded within it. It just kind of updates based on any changes in the cost of living, not in changes in the overall economic well-being of the country as a whole.